Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it about a minute more and let people trickle in here. All right, we have a great panel today, so I do want to go ahead and get going here so we can maximize our time today. So hello and welcome everyone to our second installment of the 2023 Transportation Tuesday webinar series. My name is Robert Morris. I'm a senior analyst here at the RTA, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I'm happy to first introduce Leanne Redden, the RTA's Executive Director.
Thank you, Robert. As you just said, I'm Leanne Redden. I'm the Executive Director here at the RTA. It's my pleasure also to welcome you to, this is our second Transportation Tuesday webinar for this year. I think these are amazing sessions that the staff here coordinate with others and bring everything together. It's great. So it's part of a 4-part series that is bringing together both the RTA staff, regional and national leaders to discuss trends in transportation as they relate really to the implementation of our strategic plan that is called Transit is the Answer. We think transit is an integral part in all of this. So I'm looking forward for the session that you're going to hear some more about and exploring specifically mobility hubs and their potential in our region. Mobility hubs, I think many of you, if you're listening, probably have a fairly good sense of what they might be, but they're really those places of connectivity where, you know, different travel options kind of come together. And it's that sort of connection or that nexus between walking, biking, transit, and other shared mobility options, you know, shared bikes, scooter stations, and all of that, and how they all come together and how they, you know, really enhance mobility in our region. It's an exciting group of panelists that we have today who are sort of spearheading some mobility hub work in our region, as well as from Minneapolis, who have come, you know, we can learn from as well. So without any further ado, you don't need to hear from me any longer. I'm going to just thank you for being here and turn it over to everyone so you guys can dive in and get started. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Leanne. Like Leanne referred to, this is a 4-part series of our Transportation Tuesday webinar. We had on June 6th, a new era for Chicago Transit, adapting service to address changing and unmet needs of riders. And thank you to our 3 service boards here in the region for participating. Next week, we have on June 20th, Transit in Industrial Corridors, Community Experience, Accessibility, and Freight Interaction. And finally, on June 27th, we've got Advancing a Regional Capital Strategy, how transit is the answer, and the RTA's capital program shape the maintenance, upkeep, and improvement of transit infrastructure. And today, of course, we have Mobility Hubs, connecting transportation options for a more seamless experience. Here again is our shameless plug for Transit is the Answer, our newly adopted strategic plan here at the RTA. Transit is the Answer articulates our vision, guiding principles, and an agenda for advocacy and action. Please check out the link that we'll post here in the chat to find out more about Transit is the Answer. Today, we'd like to hear more about how mobility hubs can contribute to that more equitable, accessible, and safer transit system for all users, which are our priorities of the newly adopted plan. The RTA is also excited to have taken some steps in the past year and recent months to become more involved in the mobility hub space. The RTA awarded Equiticity a grant from our community planning program for the Go Hub, which we'll hear definitely a lot more about coming up today. And the RTA is also excited to support a grant application from the Shared Use Mobility Center for a regional mobility hub framework. Again, we're super excited to bring in industry leaders today to take us through their work and have a robust conversation. We're privileged to be joined by these 3 esteemed guests. As Metro Transit Shared Mobility Program Manager, Meredith Klekotka provides strategic leadership on integrating transit with new services such as bike share, car share, and TNCs. She runs pilots like microtransit solutions, mobility as a service, and mobility hubs for the Transit Agency and the Metropolitan Council, which is the Twin Cities Regional MPO. Prior to her work in the Twin Cities, Meredith led the Smart Cities Initiative in Indianapolis and worked in active transportation advocacy in Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, and in St. Louis. She's a graduate of the University of Illinois at Chicago and Carleton College. Next, Olatunji Obayi-Reed is the president and CEO of Equiticity, a racial equity movement, programming and advocating for racial equity, increased mobility, and racial justice to improve the lives of Black and Brown people across the United States. Obayi co-founded and recently served as the president and CEO of the Slow Roll Chicago Bicycle Movement. And he's also a frequent speaker, panelist, facilitator at conferences around the world. Benjie de la Peña is the Chief Executive Officer of the Shared Use Mobility Center, SUMC, here in Chicago. He also chairs the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation, founded at Agile City Partners, and writes and curates Makeshift Mobility, which is a fortnightly newsletter concerning innovations in informal transportation. Also convenes the Shared Mobility 2030 Action Agenda and edits and produces Pop Transport. Thank you to all three of these panelists for being here today to share all of your knowledge and expertise. We will start with Metro Transit. Secondly, we'll hear from Equiticity, and we'll finish up with our Shared Use Mobility Center partner. Without further ado, Meredith Klekotka from Metro Transit.
Hey, thanks, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. Meredith Klekotka. I'm the Shared Mobility Program Manager, as Robert said, for Metro Transit. Metro Transit is the service provider for the Twin Cities. So, prior to pandemic, we were serving about 80 million rides a year. Now that's changed. Obviously, we're at about probably 39 million last year, but I'm kind of in a unique role. And Robert, if you go to the next slide, I can talk about it. So I had the opportunity, because our transit agency is under the regional MPO. I do a lot of work for the MPO as well as it relates to shared mobility. And these are one of the projects that I got to work on, is creating our mobility hub planning guide for the region. So this really grew out of an effort by all of our regional partners to do their own versions of mobility hubs. There were a lot of initiatives across the Twin Cities. So Minneapolis was running a pilot. We had St. Paul doing the EV car share, which is our nonprofit car sharing system. We also had MnDOT, our DOT, running an ABC ramps pilot. So a lot of the stakeholders identified that we really need some consensus about what hubs look like across the region for the purposes of wayfinding and improved user experience. And so we started that study in 2020. And if you want to advance, next slide, please. And we came up with this planning guide. I really wanted something to be able to point people to different local governments to establish a set of regionally significant hubs. So some have neighborhood hubs, but we were really looking at our regionally significant hubs, and then really assist agencies with the implementation process. So how do you advance mobility hubs from concept to planning and implementation and management? And so we included that in there, and you can see the 3 modules. I'm going to go over them pretty briefly here, but basically the idea is, how do you plan for it? How do you design it? And how do you implement? In addition to that, we did come up with kind of a master project list, but I should say it wasn't prescriptive. So it was sort of a guide in terms of project list. The idea is that entities like counties or whoever's implementing could take it back and ground truth it with what the experience is along their system. So next slide. We started out with a huge universe of hubs. So we had about 7,000 access points that were transitways and bikeways. And then we managed to work it down to about 400 location, and then ranked 50 priority locations based on some select criteria, including things like equity, zero vehicle households, areas of concentrated poverty, as well as areas of concentrated wealth, to kind of look at that balance. So we are at about 50 priority locations now, and a lot of the cities are going back and kind of ground truthing where that is at the moment. Next slide. So the first module, how we broke it down, is asking kind of 8 structural questions for planners. I just highlighted one of them that I liked. So how do you organize and prioritize hub elements at each location? So thinking about the goal of what your hub's going to do is one of the most important elements here. It leads to your design, it leads to who gets priority. I think Chicago has a nice modal priority. I don't know if that's been updated or it's the same from a number of years ago, but with pedestrians and transit kind of being the highest priority of movement within the city. So think about that same element, but applied to hubs. So next slide. The second section is really a kit of parts. So this came about because one of the questions that I get asked a lot working with the MPO is I'll have smaller cities or entities call and say, hey, can we get a scooter share here? And how do we do that? And it's not always market viable, and it's always not great depending on the location. So we wanted to put some criteria on who are you trying to attract in terms of shared mobility vendors? How are you deciding placement? What is the goal? So if you go to the next slide, you'll see we just kind of came up with this guidance. We did have to adhere to different land use categories. So we split our hubs into, because we're a 7-county region, so it's a very large region. We split it into like the urban cores and the downtowns, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and a couple others surrounding, to that kind of edge area where you're not really going to see a lot of mobility hubs, and tried to match service and design and different elements of the hubs on indicating what's appropriate there and what's not recommended. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So this is the typology. We really looked at this because we are the regional MPO, so they're trying to indicate where is appropriate spacing for these hubs and what should be applied for competitive funding, right? If you're in an edge or suburban district, it may not be exactly the right place, or your hubs might look very different than they are going to in the core city. So this is just a visual representation that we had done on the kind of commercial to residential to suburban side of things to give a people idea of the kind of breadth of hubs that are being implemented now across the region. Next slide. So the last module in the planning guide is implementation pathways. These were the 5 areas that we focused on in terms of recommendations or potential barriers. And the 2 that I'm going to highlight in the next, I'm going to go into example of one of the implementations that we're doing right now. The real focus is on retrofit, quite frankly. And now with the legislation that just passed in Minnesota, I don't know how much folks have heard about it, but it is a 3/4 cent sales tax for transit in the region. So this is a 300 to 500 million increase in our operational budget and for capital expansion. So obviously we have huge opportunity in terms of integration into existing capital projects, but that can be challenging. And I think one of the questions that is going to talk about that. So next slide. So I'm now speaking on behalf of City of Minneapolis. No, I'm just kidding. But I did want to highlight this because I figured folks would want to see it. It was a kind of preeminent mobility hub exercise. The pilot ran from 2019 to 2022. They actually didn't deploy this year. The locations were co-located at transit stops, and the approach that Minneapolis took was very much neighborhood-based. So they weren't looking at regionally significant hubs. They really wanted access points for people to get out of their neighborhood to connect to the larger transit system. One of the things that we found is that evaluation was challenging. So we were trying to track, we helped them with some evaluation at Metro Transit. We're trying to track whether trip chaining happened, if people were accessing transit. Obviously, there's lots of technology barriers there on why it's hard to get at that data. But one of the most successful components, I think, of their program was the neighborhood ambassadors that were funded as part of this work. So they were who maintained the stations. They were always based and from the neighborhood. And it made for a really amazing environment there, more eyes on the street kind of situation. So that was a really successful one that I wanted to highlight. And then next slide. What Metro Transit is working on now and kind of our role is operationalizing the planning guide. So we support hubs that other people create, and also we're working on our own approach to hubs. So some of the work that we've done is this like multimodal analysis, for example, which is bike share, scooter shares, starts and stops throughout the region along our high frequency network to understand better where we can invest in kind of modular parking, which is one of our approaches to early approaches to mobility hubs. And then the next is we actually have a 5-year capital plan where we've invested, it's called the CIP, where we've made some investments into the future for mobility hubs. And then the last one is figuring out how to incorporate into our existing and planned transit ways. So those are our BRT, LRT corridors across the region. Then go ahead to the next slide. This is the pilot that is just starting up. So this is our regional mobility hub pilot. We took some of those regionally significant locations that were identified through the planning guide and partnered with the city of Minneapolis to basically put in this application of we're moving from pilot to permanent now in this structure. So you have some city locations, and those are the ones that the city is in charge of, like Riverside or Chicago Lake or Hiawatha, all of those. And then when you see the terminus for the BRT routes there, Brooklyn Center, Maplewood Mall, Sunray Transit Center, those are our locations that we're going to be working on. And basically the goal for this project is really to increase multimodal connections that are made at transit facilities. It's easier within the core because there's lots of other shared mobility options. So some of the transit centers are much more suburban locations, may not have amenities, but as part of the project, we did budget for the installation of EV car share, which is our nonprofit car sharing service. So we're investing directly into another shared mobility service, which is complicated, both financially and legally. But the idea is really to create seamless transitions and provide those options and to see more people making those first last mile connections there. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Robert.
Thank you so much, Meredith. We will now go ahead and before I turn it over to Equiticity here, I want to remind everyone that we will have a question and answer segment here after our presentations. And you're also welcome to put your questions in the chat throughout. We'll get to them here at the end. But I do want to turn it over now to Olatunji Obayi-Reed from Equiticity.
Thank you, Robert. We'll start with an opening video, please.
I am the founding president and CEO of the Equiticity Racial Equity Movement. We are operationalizing racial equity by harnessing our collective power through research, advocacy, programs, and community mobility rituals to improve our neighborhoods and improve the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in our society. We do community mobility rituals because they will have a potential to reduce violence in our neighborhoods. When there's a rhythmic frequency, that helps trust grow at the neighborhood level. When trust goes up in the neighborhood, the perception of violence goes down. When the perception of violence goes down, more people are willing to walk and bike and shop. And when our streets are more vibrant, we will have the potential of reducing violence in our neighborhoods. This is why we exist. This is why we work. This is why we ride.
All right, next slide. Hello, everyone. The title of this presentation is the Go Hub, a Community Mobility Center. Next slide, please. My name's Obai. Full name is Olatunji Obai Reed. I am the founding president and CEO of the Equiticity Racial Equity Movement. Here's all my contact information. And this bottom link is a link to this actual presentation, and this QR code will also take you to this presentation as well. Next slide. Equiticity is a racial equity movement operationalizing racial equity by harnessing our collective power through research, advocacy, programs, community mobility rituals, and social enterprises to improve the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in our society. We're a national organization headquartered in Chicago, and the vast majority of the work we do in Chicago is focused on the North Lawndale neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. We're really agnostic with respect to sector and or policy area. However, at this phase in our evolution as an organization, the sector we are the most focused on is transportation. Next slide. The Go Hub. I want to start by sharing a little bit about our origin story on the Go Hub. So I learned about mobility hubs probably about 4 years ago now. When I first learned about it, I loved the concept, and my understanding of the of mobility hubs, it was a model that hyper-concentrated mobility devices all together, like at an intersection, a parking lot, all together, all of the different mobility devices are all hyper-concentrated together. That model normally is adjacent to transit, whether at a bus terminal or a train station or a strong bus corridor. Transit is adjacent. The pricing models of market rates, so people are paying with whatever they normally pay to access those devices. The space where those devices are concentrated are normally not staffed. So the relationships that people have in the neighborhood are with the devices, not with people. So with that context, we love the model. However, we wanted to reimagine the model as one for our audience at the neighborhood level. And our primary audience are Black and Brown people living in a low to moderate income community and experiencing severe transportation inequities and an entire host of compounding inequities. Next slide, please. So given that that traditional model, our interest in that model, our primary audience, there's a few things that are really critical for us in executing developing and executing the Go Hub. One is that we want the Go Hub to be neighborhood-based. We want it to be hyper-local focused and to serve as a community mobility center designed to increase mobility, create jobs, improve health, and reduce violence in the North Lawndale neighborhood. We also want the model to be community-owned and focus on a hyper-local primary audience. Again, Black and Brown people living in an LMI community and experiencing severe transportation inequities and other compounding inequities. We want the Go Hub to be a part of the economic development for the neighborhood with a special focus on the Pulaski corridor in North Lawndale. And then finally, we also want the Go Hub to serve as a national model for a replicable, comprehensive, community-owned mobility hub. Next slide, please. So our model brings together three integrated elements of hardware, software, and a physical building. The hardware really represents that traditional model that I mentioned, and it brings together both mobility devices and infrastructure. So the mobility devices we include in our mix are shared electric vehicles, shared e-bikes, shared e-scooters. We also have added into our mix autonomous or semi-autonomous shuttles. And we think about hardware as including both transit infrastructure and streetscape infrastructure. The next item is software. So we think about the software as being the work we do to socialize people around the act of mobility. For us, that includes community mobility rituals. We do 5 types of rituals at the neighborhood level: community bicycle ride, neighborhood walking tours, public transit excursions, group scooter rolls, and open streets festivals. We also think about the software as being a hyperlocal advocacy coalition. This is made up of our members and residents in the neighborhood to identify their needs, what do they need to grow their mobility, and then organizing ourselves to move the elected officials and stakeholders to bring those resources to bear in our neighborhoods. We also think about software as education and training and mental health services. So we recognize that in Black and Brown neighborhoods, concerns around violence are deep, so deep that they shape our mode choice. So we have to address violence and trauma in our neighborhoods to move people in our communities to increase their mobility. And that also goes to the next one, which is trauma-informed programming. So we want the programming to reflect the needs of our community, and trauma is an important element of that work. And then the final one is a physical building. The physical building serves as a space, a welcome center for people to come in and explore how to grow their mobility. So for us, that includes a building that'll house, of course, the Go Hub. It will have space for training classes, space for mental health services and healing rooms, a bicycle repair station, a retail shop. We want to create a number of reasons why people will have to come into our space, and not limited to we don't want the Go Hub to be the only reason people come into the space. And then we also think about the space as having an adjacent lot that serves as a gathering space where there's seating areas, there's a performing arts stage, shipping containers, murals. It's also a space where we'll stage our mobility devices. We do want our mobility devices to be staged off the public way on private property. We love for that gathering space to have digital wayfinding, signage, semi-permanent art exhibits, and a community garden. So that the physical building is adjacent to the gathering space, and we see it as all one big space serving as the Go Hub. And our location in North Lawndale is adjacent to the Pink Line station on Pulaski. Next slide, please. So our design process started with establishing a community advisory council. That community advisory council is made up of 7 community-based organizations in North Lawndale and 3 larger citywide civic organizations here in Chicago, and Shared Use Mobility Center is one of those. And all of those organizations were funded to participate in our community advisory council. We also think about our community mobility rituals as a part of our design process, because we think about the community mobility rituals as an opportunity to introduce people at the neighborhood level to the concept of the Go Hub and receive feedback from them. We did resident interviews in partnership with Dr. Jesus Barajas, who's a professor at UC Davis, and his environmental justice class. We also did a series of design charrettes with residents and our architects. Next slide, please. Our stakeholder engagement process was funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies and Capua Consulting, where we executed a robust stakeholder engagement effort. We partnered with Emergent Labs and the Center for Neighborhood Technology to help us execute this strategy. And that included a series of one-on-one introductory calls with government agencies, including state DOT, Cook County, County DOT, City DOT, our MPO, the City Department of Planning, RTA, Mayor's Office, and several elected officials. We also hosted 2 site visits at the location where we're interested in building the Go Hub. That included a presentation, a tour of the site. We also had lunch in the neighborhood where we could have a little more discussion, and then we did targeted follow-ups. Next slide, please. So our next steps, this is still a vision. This is a strategy that we're still executing. Our next steps are to create a higher degree of community ownership for the Go Hub in North Lawndale, continue to engage with stakeholders about our vision, establish site control of the property where we want the Go Hub to be located, and raise the funding we need to build the Go Hub and implement the Go Hub. We anticipate total dollar amount for one-time costs is about $7.5 to $10 million, and annual costs of about $2 million per year. Potential funding sources that we consider are City of Chicago, State of Illinois, Cook County DOT, US DOT, US DOE, and the philanthropic community, both foundations and corporations. And we're also interested in executing a capital campaign in support of the Go Hub. We anticipate that construction, once we've raised the money, construction could take 1 to 2 years, which would put us at a grand opening in about 2 to 3 years. And with that, next slide, we'll close it out with a video, and I'll hand it back to my colleague, Robert. Oh, my apologies. We got a couple of more slides. All right. We do not build the Go Hub because there's a lot of good people with good hearts, good hearts and warm bodies come and go. Shifting political winds come and go. Goofy smiles and awkward handshakes come and go. We build the Go Hub because we operationalize a commitment to racial equity and mobility justice in Chicago and cities across the country. And to get that done, we need legislation over good hearts. Next slide. And we are deeply concerned about any institutions, any systems which harm us. To those, we say, burn it down and build anew. One of my favorite people is Marlo Stanfield from HBO's The Wire. He once told someone, you want it to be one way, but it's the other way. We need systems and institutions which nourish Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in our society. Next slide. So what happens when we turn on the power and equity moves like electricity through our homes, our streets, our neighborhoods, and our cities? Equiticity, power plus equity is greater than. Next. As you all leave this webinar, I ask you to do this for me. Turn on the power and let equity flow. Thank you. And there's my contact information again, and now we'll close it out with a quick video. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Obai. Now we will go ahead and turn it over to Benjie de la Peña from Shared Use Mobility Center.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm going to take over the screen and use my screen instead. Can you see my screen?
All good,
All right.
Benjie.
Yes.
Robert and the RTA team, thank you for having us. This has been really interesting. Time check. How much time do I have to present before we have Q&A?
About 10 minutes.
Okay, I still have 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. So I am the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. We're based here in Chicago. We also have offices in LA. Relationships with the two presentations and organizations you just had. We had the privilege of helping the Twin Cities come up with their Shared Mobility Action Plan in 2017, and we nursed the Shared Mobility Collaborative from then, and we're just so proud of how far they've taken this. And as Albayi said, we are part of the advisors for Equiticity. We don't really give them very much advice because they're doing really, really great work. We're just kind of right there. Yeah, cool. So we're more cheerleaders for their work. What we do is we do research and provide technical assistance to communities and cities dealing with shared mobility. One of our major projects, so we've been around 10 years. We were formed to convene the shared mobility sector in 2013, and we've been convening them ever since. We also do research in the sector. Our two major projects is a project with the Federal Transit Administration, where we're helping something like 70 public agencies, that's DOTs and transit agencies across the country, who are trying out or piloting shared mobility. We do provide the technical assistance, and we handhold and we convene them. On the other side, we also have a major project with the California Air Resources Board. California is taking cap and trade money and providing grants to historically neglected, underserved communities, read indigenous communities and communities of color, who do not have public transportation and are trying out shared mobility. And we're working with about 50 of those communities. Our work is really centered around, we want to replace car-centric transportation with people-focused shared mobility for these three very urgent reasons, right? It's climate change, the climate crisis is staring us in the face. Transportation is the fastest growing and still growing source of carbon. We want to promote equity, and I'll repeat this constantly. Electrification is good to decarbonize. It'll never be enough because 46,000 people died last year from vehicle crashes. Electrification is not going to do anything about that. And we want to strengthen community because basically the infrastructure we built is so focused on individual travel in our 2-ton vehicles that loneliness is an epidemic, and it's basically tearing up our communities. So for that, jumping into, let me pull out the lens a bit of why we need to do mobility hubs. One, as I mentioned, is mobility insecurity, right? And what's mobility insecurity? Alexandra Murphy, who is at the University of Michigan, did a study of, do people know what to do if their primary mode of transportation is out of commission, whether it's their own car or the bus, and if it doesn't show, do they know what they're going to do? Can they get to work? Can they get to where they need to go? And they discovered that 1 in 4 adults in the US experience transportation insecurity or mobility insecurity. In other words, if your car breaks down, you have no idea how you're going to get to work or school, or if your bus doesn't come, you have no idea. Even more so if there's a medical concern, and there's research that proves that people don't go to doctor's appointments or don't set doctor's appointments because they don't know how to get there. And that's because of this that we've built, right? I'm preaching to the choir. We built this infrastructure that is all about individual movement in personalized vehicles, 2-ton vehicles. They're going to be heavier when they're electrified, to go where we want to go by ourselves, but it costs a lot of money. You think the federal government is spending a lot on transportation? I think FHWA was $430 billion last year. That's just 1/3 of all government spending on transportation. But that total number is dwarfed by what households spend on transportation. In 2021, US households combined spend $2.4 trillion on transportation, to pay for transportation. Mostly that's by car. right? And so when we talk about electrification, I don't want to knock it. We need to electrify. You can give me that 9,000, is it 7,500 or $9,000 discount on buying an EV? If my family is earning less than $30,000, what am I going to do with that? Right? But we've built out our infrastructure, so this is what it prioritizes. And there are, again, preaching to the choir, kind of deep historical roots to this, apart from running highways through the communities of color, which we redlined and disinvested on. So transportation insecurity and economic insecurity and transportation stress very, very closely mapped. This is a slide that CDOT likes to show. And I think this is not unique. Nearly every US city does. It's like this. What's the need for it? So CDOT did their Bike Chicago program. Their first round, they offered 5,000 bikes for free. They received 18,000 applications. And from the areas, mostly from the areas where there's transportation insecurity, right? So people are desperate because you need transportation to participate in your community, to get to work, and really just to earn and be an active part of your community. So the problem is, as I said, we've reduced our mobility options. And what we need to get to is to provide more mobility options. So Chicago, unlike other American cities, actually pretty rich in terms of transportation. You've got freight and rail, regional rail, we've got passenger rail, we've got bike share, and then the river and the lake, right? Which even I think, are we the third largest public transportation system? So lots of choices, and still that is not enough. Before you guys came on, Lee and I were kind of exchanging information about the UITP conference that just happened in Europe, and you go there and you feel really envious with the amount of resources other countries and other governments are putting into transportation. But apart from that, though, over the last decade, shared mobility has exploded. From car rentals to car shares to microtransit, that's the availability of options, possible options, has exploded. Not that they're really available to where you are and what you need, but they've exploded, right? And so part of what we have done is to expand the idea of what shared mobility is. Shared mobility to us is everything that frees you from having to use the private car, and that's public transportation all the way to safe sidewalks. Anything that frees you from car dependence, and that includes the systems and infrastructure. It includes the services. It includes, safe sidewalks, protected bike lanes, and then digital and information systems that make all of this easier. The problem we have with shared mobility, and which is why we need shared mobility hubs, is all tied to an app and the phone. And that has exclusionary issues, right? Because if you can't afford an internet connection or a smartphone, you're excluded. If you're unbanked, then you're excluded. The other is it exists nowhere. You only put up your app when you need it, and it doesn't exist in the geography of your brain when you don't need it. And to prove that, our brains are very, very powerful instruments of spatial orientation. I want you to think back when you were in middle school, maybe 5th grade. And when you started getting interested in other people in kind of a more romantic than friendly way, I bet if you close your eyes and you imagine yourself sitting in your seat, you can point to the direction of where your crush was sitting, right? Your brain remembers that spatial orientation. You can point to where the teacher usually stands when they're lecturing. Our brains are powerfully oriented towards figuring out space. In fact, these three scientists, John O'Keefe, Mary Britt Moser, and Edward Moser, got a Nobel Prize for identifying two particular neurons whose only job is to figure out where we are in space. You can blindfold a person, have them move around in a room, and they will figure out the shape of their room in their heads because our brains are oriented towards space. The problem with shared mobility is it's not oriented anywhere. Maybe you remember where the bus stop is. Maybe if there's a Divvy bike hub, you'll remember where that is. Where the rest is, you don't know. And now you need to pull up your app, and you only pull it up when you need it. But if we had mobility hubs, let me back up a bit. Of course, everything being on apps, this is the percentage of households with internet access in Chicago. And as you see, there are quite a bit that do not have internet access. bet you it maps to the areas that were neglected in redline. So mobility hubs gives us the infrastructure of choices and gives us a spatial orientation to remember it when we don't need it, so that when we need it, we know where to go, right? Oh, the cargo bikes are there, or that's where the delivery lockers are, or that's where I can get P2P car sharing. Okay? And so Meredith already had a really good presentation of their mobility hubs, and so I won't repeat this, but it really is where you can get transportation options. The other thing that I would point is it doesn't have to be anchored alone on rail or public transportation, or even bus rapid transit. You could have 2 bus stops, a bus stop with 4 buses running through it. You can build a mobility hub around that. So we need to plan and invest and build in a citywide network, because again, it gives us choices, right? The other thing that we need to look at is the logistical arrangement. So Robert had mentioned this proposal we have that we're hoping gets funded to build a framework on how do you build a network of mobility hubs. And the thing we want to take to it is, what are the logistical choices you need to make in terms of servicing these hubs? And so, yes, the layers of who gets to use it, yes, the layers of where it's available, yes, the layers of what do they most usually need, but also what is the service infrastructure you need to be able to provide this much? Where would you need the maintenance hubs and all of that? And that could be layered on. And the whole goal is to address mobility insecurity. The other thing I'll point out, and I'll wrap up soon, is that this particularly could address the needs of women and caregivers who research shows travel very differently for men. They do a lot more trip chaining, and it costs them. So I encourage you to look at Sarah Kaufman's studies on the pink transportation tax. And so they make shorter non-commute trips, and it's harder to do that with our transportation choices, which is why mostly you need a car, right? And so I'll almost end with this slide. The problem we have in public transportation is that we oriented most of it in a hub and spoke orientation for the downtown commute. Guess who does the downtown commute more? Men. Guess what schedules we run on these public transportation systems? The morning commute to get to work and the afternoon commute to get to work. Again, women and caregivers travel very differently on very different hours. Every city in the US where you go to will have this, hub and spoke, and they're all talking about the Circle Line. We have a Circle Line here. Boston has talked about the Circle Line. DC has talked about the Circle Line. What that does is, just because we understand suburb to suburb is very hard, but you can imagine on this last panel that we could fill that up instead with mobility hubs across, so that it's not just that can I get around all the way, but also how do I get within my neighborhoods or to the next neighborhood. And with that, I'll stop. Oh, I'll share with you the Shared Mobility 2030 Action Agenda. Please check it out. And the whole goal of this, which is a public sector, private sector, and not-for-profit endeavor, is to make shared mobility much more reliable, more available, and more accessible, and then driving a car by 2030. And that's available on sharedmobility2030.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Benjie, and thank you to all 3 of our panelists today. I would like to open it up. We've got about 10 minutes or so for Q&A. I have some questions, but I'd love to get to our attendees' questions first. Jessica, I'll turn it over. If you're able to pull some questions from the chat. Was it Jessica or Natalie? And we can pose some questions for our panelists here.
Yeah, I could share a question. So earlier someone asked, does the RTA plan on adding indoor protected bike parking at major transit hubs to make it safer and easier to leave our bike there? But this can go for any of our panelists and their thoughts on indoor protected bike parking.
I can try to answer that from the RTA perspective. We do directly develop bike parking through our Access to Transit program, which we do offer to municipalities throughout the region. We have done covered bike parking. I don't believe that we've done any indoor bike parking projects yet. But I think that that's an interesting topic for us to explore, I guess, in the future through our Access to Transit program.
I can move on to another question, which asked about developing mobility hubs and housing community developments and the conversation around that. And our areas rapidly developing housing areas are in need of more development, particularly more affordable development, considering high priority for mobility hubs.
I might wade into that. Here's the interesting thing about mobility hubs. Rather, the hard thing about TOD, when I was working on this a decade ago, was that the housing and transportation developers used to call it brain damage, because usually it would be anchored on fixed rail. The moment you say where the station is, all your real estate, your land prices go up. Then it's very, very hard to roll out affordable housing. The thing with mobility hubs is that it's very lightweight, unless it's anchored on an existing rail station. It's very lightweight. Again, you can have two bus stations, bus stops with number of buses running through it. And you could have a public amenity, as Meredith showed, right? You could have a library or a daycare or a workforce training center, right? And you could have small housing develop slowly around it. Hopefully, we don't know until we develop this all, it won't have the kind of development gentrifying forces that fixed rail tends to do. So I think there's way more opportunity to be able to do this than it is with, brain damage of TOD. We need TODs, it's just harder to do.
And I can tell, we are actually doing a mobility hub project that was funded through the same federal application timing that the mobility hub regional project was. And it's more focused on TOD. So we have a housing developer and we're changing some of the bus configuration over there to improve access to first last mile. It's a corridor that really needs a lot more east-west connections, but it's part of a much larger TOD project. We don't originate many of those though, and there's a lot of challenges with doing TOD in Minnesota that I won't go into.
I'll just quickly respond. Also, Transform in Oakland is doing a mobility hub as a part of an affordable housing development. It's a really cool model. I don't know that ETOD is a part of that affordable housing development, but that's a model where the mobility hub is inside the affordable housing development. And for Equiticity, we do look for density of housing around an ideal location, because we want a great number of people within walking distance to both the Go Hub and to transit.
And I'll claim bragging rights. We're Transform's partners on that mobility hub in affordable housing. Oakland, and I think Richmond, a couple other cities in the Bay Area.
That's awesome work. And I know the city of Chicago with their ETOD policy and the work that they do around that. And I'll also kind of shamelessly plug the RTA. We are in project development for our first ETOD for the city of Joliet in downtown Joliet at their Gateway Center, which really serves as a mobility hub there for the folks in Joliet. I think we've got another question that I saw in the chat. What are currently the biggest barriers to developing more and better mobility hubs?
Ooh, so many. One is a dedicated source of funding. You have to cobble these funding sources together, right? It's not like, oh, you want a highway? Sure, here's highway money, and maybe you can use some CMAQ money. So you have to cobble it together. Second is we like to fund capital infrastructure, capital dollars. We don't have money for services. And with shared mobility, we thought that, okay, you private companies can run all of this. They can't, because there is no transportation system, I'm going to insist this, urban, but actually more than urban, that survives without some form of public support. We get around in cars because we built out cars on public, rather highways and roads on public land. So it's the viability of the companies and how we fund them so that they continue to serve is the other key question. And again, I mentioned UITP. It's you look at Transport for London with envy because they've got congestion pricing that pays for the expansion of services where no matter what time of day in the downtown core, a bus passes by every 5 minutes. So multiple challenges, but we're early in the game, and what we need to show is how viable these things are and how they can serve more people and kind of widen the service shed of people getting around without their cars.
Obey, I'm interested with what you have to say on this one. I had a couple of thoughts, but a lot of them are Benjie just captured, so I want to give you some space.
Thank you, Meredith. I imagine some of what I'm going to say you may be thinking about as well. I think one of the barriers is this sort of natural impulse for agencies to drive planning and implementation. We need more community-owned models, more community-controlled models where CBOs at the neighborhood level are taking a leadership position to bring mobility hubs to life. I'm more confident that when CBOs are implementing this work, it'll do much better. These projects will do a much better job of addressing our specific needs. Funding, I totally agree with Benjie on this. It's tough to fund this kind of model. I will also say, thinking about these models as addressing violence are critical, and all types of violence, not just interpersonal, police violence, vehicular violence, and interpersonal violence. Strategizing around how does these models help reduce violence at the neighborhood level. I'll hand it back to Meredith here.
Yeah, those are great points. And to like expound on that, I think one of the things that, especially if a transit agency is looking to do mobility hubs go beyond strictly utilitarian, where you cross modes, right? They're about public space and creating public spaces, and transit agencies don't really want to build more public spaces. I know at Metro Transit, there is an inherent struggle about, we're trying to divest a lot of our interior spaces because the maintenance and construction is so difficult to manage. So I would say kind of that balance between we are creating public space, but who to maintain is a big one. So when you're thinking about hubs, thinking about maintenance is a big piece. And then funding, but I have a little different orientation on funding because I'm going through this right now. Whether you're using local versus federal funding is a big difference, especially FTA funding. So do you want to go through a NEPA process for your mobility hub? Like, is it a major construction project? It'll set you back another year. Local funds tend to be better for these types of hubs. Are you touching anything that used FTA dollars at one point to construct? If you are, you'll have to buy it back essentially from the FTA if it's still within its useful life. And then as Benjie said, the variability of vendors. So if you build something permanent in concrete for one vendor, just make sure it's interoperable. I mean, like if you're doing electric car charging for EVs that are, available to everyone. Those are just some initial thoughts.
We are at time here. I wanted to see if we could fit in just one more question quickly. I did put in my email address, or here, I'm putting my email address in the chat now, so you can follow up with me. If you do have any additional questions, we'll work on getting you guys answers and follow up with individuals. But I had one last question that was here in the chat that I wanted to see if we had a couple opinions on really quickly. And that was, I'm sorry, I now of course lost it. What are the, it was about, okay, here we go. Sorry about that, guys. What work is being done to improve digital accessibility for people with disabilities so they can more easily find and use shared mobility and mobility hubs?
I think that's a really great question. There's lots of ways, right, on technology and all of that, but the beauty of mobility hubs, which GoHub shows, right, is you can center people. It's not that you need an app. You can show up, and our version of it needs a concierge or valet, a community attendant, right, to help you also understand the systems. Or if you're unbanked and you want to pay by cash or some other way, it can facilitate you and kind of gives this human face to shared mobility, and with that layering kind of community functions on that. So I don't have a specific answer of what is being done, but the promise of mobility hubs is you can put people back into the picture again.
Did they mean digital accessibility in terms of making the technology systems, the shared mobility providers, or in terms of the space? Sorry, just to clarify.
Marcel, did you want to, that was a question from our chat. He said both.
Yeah, so I can speak to some of the work Metro Transit's doing, but I would actually point to Seattle. I think Seattle is doing a really cool mobility hub, zero, like no platform, no curbs in terms of like actual physical accessibility for their spaces. We also have been piloting some technology in terms of directing people through audio cues for low vision, in terms of integrating that software with some of the shared mobility options as well, like microtransit or any of those types of vehicles. So it'll actually give you directions once you engage it, and it's like having an attendant there, basically, and that's gotten a lot of really good feedback in the pilot phase.
All right, guys. Thank you so much to everyone who stayed a few minutes over. Awesome panel today. Benjie, Obai, Meredith, thank you guys so much for your time. Again, thanks for attending, everyone. And we do have a couple more Transportation Tuesday events. I believe the registration link for next week's webinar was dropped in the chat. So we're looking forward to seeing everyone again next Tuesday. And the following Tuesday as well. So thanks, guys, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you.